Video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Some paintings are bold and brash, loud and exuberant, and others are quiet and contemplative and rely upon nuance. Portraiture often falls in this second category, and this painting is no different. Painted in Morocco by the artist Gordon Coutts, this is a stunning, quiet, contemplative portrait of a man deep in thought. But this nuance, this delicacy, is shattered by damage and by some old conservation work. When the painting was glued to a sheet of masonite, vertical striations were impressed upon the paint layer, and this takes us out of the magic of the painting. It removes the nuance, and this image becomes about the surface, specifically this unsightly vertical pattern. Of course, when this old work was performed, it was lined to a new piece of canvas with wax, the tacking edges removed, and then the wax canvas glued to a sheet of masonite, a wholly inappropriate material for paintings. This all needs to be corrected, to be reversed, the painting cleaned, and the subtle delicacy brought back to what inevitably will be a haunting and captivating portrait, just as the artist and sitter imagined it to be. Gordon Coutts was born in Aberdeen, Scotland in October of 1868. He studied at the Glasgow School of Art, in London at the Royal Academy, in Paris at the Académie Julian, and in Melbourne at the National Gallery School. In the early 1900s, Coutts traveled all over the world, including Tangier, Morocco, where he fell in love with the landscape and the people. At the end of the 19th century, artists were traveling all over the world to explore. Many European artists found themselves inextricably attracted to the Middle East and the so-called Orient. They painted vibrant scenes of daily life, portraits, landscapes, things that didn't exist back home in Europe. This movement became known as Orientalism, and with the publication of writer, professor, and critic Edward Said's book Orientalism in 1978, was deemed problematic. Said established the claim that any and all statements by Westerners about the Middle East can be dismissed as worthless and racist. A powerful, broad-reaching, and somewhat reductive thesis, Said's intentions to push back on colonialism, while well-intended, were misplaced. The artists who fell in love with the Middle East and East were not seeking to exploit it or fetishize it. They were deeply in love with the people, the places, the sights, the sounds, the experiences of those cultures. These artists painted with skill, sensitivity, reverence, and respect. And while the consumers of these images may have fetishized them, the artists certainly did not. In the late 20s, Coutts and his wife settled in Palm Springs, where they built a Moroccan-style home which they named Dar Maroc, and eventually was converted into a boutique hotel that exists there today. Coutts' love for what he found in Morocco is evident in his paintings, and it's our task to take that same care and same love and work to restore this painting to its former glory. Researching Gordon Coutts and Orientalism was a lesson in the power of discovery and all the amazing things that are online, and the idea that if you build it, they will come. So what are you waiting for? Launch a website and carve out your own corner of the internet. And I know what you're saying, I don't need a website, but maybe you do. Maybe you want to share your poetry, your painting, or your videos, or maybe you have a small business that doesn't yet exist online, in which case it doesn't really exist at all, does it? And there's no easier way to get online than with Squarespace. They've taken all of the guesswork out of websites, from registering a domain to eliminating code. Squarespace has you covered. With their comprehensive platform, you can launch a simple blog, an online gallery, or a robust e-commerce solution with just a few clicks. They've taken care of everything from search engine optimization, email marketing, and a whole suite of tools for online content creators. And of course, making sure that your website looks beautiful and works everywhere. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. The vertical striations are so distracting that I'm actually really excited to see how I can get rid of them, to restore this painting to what it should look like without distraction and old bad work. And that all begins by removing it from the support. Because there's a lot of wax on this canvas, when the tacks were driven in, they got a coating of wax, which is now making it very easy to remove them from the wood. Wax, when sticky, is an adhesive, but when cool is a release agent, and so peeling off this canvas from the support is actually not terribly difficult. Once I've removed all of the edges, I try to remove the stretcher and masonite, but of course it's glued down with wax. So I'm going to use a tool and pry up this support. It's a strainer, not original, and it has no purpose here, from the back of the masonite. Because I need to take this painting over to the hot table and expose it to heat. And having this big piece of wood creating an air gap on the back will make the transfer of heat almost impossible. At the hot table, which has already been warmed up, I will place the painting face down on a sheet of mylar and allow it to sit for a little bit. It has started to bow a little, so I'll flip it over, and then I'll put some weight on the front so that the back can also be exposed to the heat. While the masonite is not a terribly great insulator, it does insulate against the heat, and so I need to expose both the front and the back so that the wax will melt. After a few more minutes, I'll take the painting, I will flip it over, and I will expose the front to heat again, switching back and forth to make sure that there is even heat distribution throughout the entire piece. After a few more minutes, I think I am ready to start removing this canvas from the masonite. I can see that the wax has started to melt. I'll start in one corner and I'll slowly peel it up, very, very gently, just to test to see how it's coming off. And then based on this, I'll move forward. And it appears to be coming off fairly easily. Now this is what is called a wax resin lining. So the use of beeswax and a resin make this a fairly effective adhesive. It's sticky and it's stiff, which means that simply heating up the wax will not release this canvas right away. It might take a little bit more persuasion. Using a palette knife, I can slowly work this edge back. I'm careful to not put too much pressure or go too fast because I don't want any of the paint to crack or flake off. But by working slowly and methodically from corner to corner and then across the entire image, I can peel back this canvas from this lining. While not as fast as a plain wax lining, the wax resin does yield eventually, and the canvas does come off fairly fluidly. That this is a relatively young canvas and not terribly brittle works in my favor. With the painting fully removed, I can see those striations, and I'm going to peel back this lining canvas from the masonite, and I can see even more striations. This leads me to believe that corrugated cardboard was used on top of this painting, or in some process, because these striations match up almost perfectly with corrugated cardboard. And so that material has impressed upon the painting something that should not be there. And now we need to get rid of it. With the table still hot, I'll place the canvas free of the lining down on the release film, and I'll let it heat up again. I want the wax to become soft, but I'm going to add some solvent to encourage it along. The solvent will break down the resin in the wax and allow it to become more fluid, and then I can come along with a palette knife and start scraping off the majority of the wax. As I do this, I can tell that there is no real damage to the painting, no real reason for it to have been adhered to a new canvas or to a sheet of masonite. This is what I would consider excessive or inappropriate work. Luckily, it's here in my studio where I can reverse all of this and treat the painting with a little bit more respect. I'll make several passes with the solvent to remove the residues that are built up of the wax and the resin. Finally, I'll take 2 sheets of blotter paper, which is a cotton rag paper that's used to absorb moisture, and I'll put the painting on it face up. While the table is still hot, I will create an envelope using cotton webbing around the painting and a new sheet of release film and mylar on top of the painting. This envelope will be taped down to the hot table. But before I do that, I'm going to expose this back of canvas with a little bit more solvent. And I want to make sure that any residues of that wax are exposed to this solvent and the heat so that they melt and get absorbed by this blotter paper. I'm effectively moving them from the canvas into the blotter paper, and that will desaturate this canvas from this wax resin mixture. The release film makes sure that nothing sticks to the face of the painting and that the painting doesn't stick to the mylar. Once the envelope has been created, I'll add the vacuum bag connectors, which allow me to extract all of the air in that envelope with a vacuum pump. This creates downward pressure on the painting and helps force all of that wax from the canvas into that blotter paper. This painting did not have a lot of accumulated surface grime. I tested that earlier on, and I determined that there's just a discolored layer of natural resin varnish, a damar, and this needs to be removed because it's creating a yellow cast across the entire painting. Using a swab rolled from a cotton ball onto a little wooden stick, which allows me to see what I'm doing better than if my hand were holding the cotton ball and getting in the way, I can start to remove this old varnish. In the process, some of the old retouching is going to come up, and that's going to start to reveal not only the real colors of the painting, but areas that have been obscured by that heavy-handed retouching. Remember, this is a painting about nuance, and so the color changes, while subtle, make a big difference. Going from this really warm, creamy white to a cooler, more stark white totally change how this painting looks, how it feels, and those subtle differences are radically important to how we understand this painting. I'll work slowly across the entire painting, and as I remove this varnish, we can start to see there is a sheen difference. Where I've removed the varnish, it's flat or more matte, and where the varnish still remains, you can see it's thicker and shinier. This is a pretty big difference. It's subtle, but the change matters. With the painting now cleaned, we can start to address some of that old retouching. The solvent took off some of it, but some still remains, and so I will turn to a mechanical approach with a scalpel. Working very carefully to chip up just the retouching, I can take off this unsightly blob that was, well, liberally applied to what is likely a very small area of damage. As it comes off, we can see the damage is really, really insignificant and certainly didn't require or necessitate that much overpaint. The same can be done with other areas where I've determined that there is excessive overpaint. The use of oil paint in retouching is something that was long ago jettisoned, speaking to the age of this conservation. My attention can now turn to the structural repairs. The old tacking edge was removed. I presume it was cut off when the painting was lined and mounted to that masonite. But we are going to be stretching this painting to a proper support, and as such, we need to add some material for the tacks to go into. And this is called an edge or strip lining. By using a piece of adhesive film ironed onto the edge, I can facilitate the addition of more material, in this case, a piece of Belgian linen that I have frayed on one end so that the edge is softer against that of the canvas. This reduces the chance that that edge will telegraph to the face of the painting. Once the film has been ironed down and the top release layer has been removed, I can lay the linen atop it and iron it down. It only takes but a few seconds for the bond to be created, but it is incredibly strong. I'll follow along with a weight with a piece of red oak attached to the bottom, which is effectively known as a clapper, and this will remove any excess moisture that was created by the exposure to the iron, moisture that could distort the canvas and wrinkle it, which we don't want. Once I have made a complete pass, I will continue on to the other 3 edges, and then the structural work will be complete. I'll trim off the canvas, and then trim off the excess frays, because those get in the way. I'll overlap these edges to create a multiple layered canvas. I want that because it will provide as much fidelity and support in the corner where there's a lot of tension, and will be when we key the stretcher out later on. Speaking of the stretcher, because the original was lost, and that strainer, which is non-keyable, it's a fixed, rigid support, was not suitable for this painting, a custom-sized stretcher was fabricated and is now ready to be assembled. This is a very high-quality support. It goes together very tight, the joints are really beautifully engineered, and it's going to provide beautiful support for this painting. And it will allow us to add tension to keep the painting taut through the use of keys. You can see that I'm not gluing or nailing these joints together at all. They're just dry fit, and that's what makes it a stretcher, the fact that it can be expanded and stretch the canvas. I'll orient the canvas onto the stretcher, and then using tacks, I will start to stretch the painting. I'll start in the center of each edge and drive in a few tacks to hold it in place. Once that's done, I'll continue to the opposing edge, pulling the canvas tight, and so on and so forth. The stretching process is not terribly complicated, but it is one that requires even distribution of tension. Once all of the edges are tacked, I'll fold the corners in, again creating kind of a gusset to add extra support, and a few extra tacks just to make sure that it doesn't come loose. I'll trim off the excess where the folds are to make it easier to fold this canvas under and make it tidier so that there's no bumps or bulges. And then I'll start addressing the excess canvas. Instead of cutting it off or gluing it down, I fold it under and tack it down with some smaller, lighter weight tacks. Once I come to the corner, I'll tuck the canvas under, fold it, and again, using some lightweight tacks, eventually tack it down. This overlap creates a nice tight joint that surely won't come loose when we key the stretcher out. Before inserting the keys, I'll drill a couple of holes in them so that we can facilitate their binding with some fishing line. Now these keys are going to allow me to add a little bit of extra tension on the painting. I've pulled it taut, but keying it out just that much, maybe a 64th of an inch, on 4 sides, allows the canvas to be a little bit tighter, and that prevents waves and distortions. As I'm moving along, I tap the front of the canvas to feel if it's tight enough and to hear what it sounds like. Once I'm satisfied, I can bind these keys in. I'll feed some fishing line through the holes, I'll pull them tight, wrap it around another tack it down, trim off the excess, and then they won't get lost or fall out. Now before I can do any retouching, I have to address the losses. Though they are minimal, it does matter. Again, we're talking about nuance here. Anything that breaks the plane or the illusion of the image is going to be problematic. And these tiny little divots where the paint was lost will do that. Even if I match the colors perfectly, if you see the divots from a raking light, you'll know that there was damage, and it will take you out of the painting and onto the surface, just like the vertical striations. Once that fill-in medium has dried over a day or so, I can remove the excess. Unlike the previous restoration and retouching, I'm not going to be excessive with what I apply to the painting. Only where the damage is, only where the paint is lost, will there be fill-in and retouching. It's always easier to overfill and then remove the excess than it is to try to contain the fill-in just to the areas of loss. Using a water-based chalk fill-in medium makes this removal process fairly easy. I can go over the area with some swabs and just lift off the excess material. It may take 1 or 2 passes, as in this case, but eventually I will get there. And then, when I get there and I'm satisfied, I can take the painting over for an isolation layer before I do any retouching. Now this isolation layer is serving multiple purposes. One, it will saturate up the paints so that I can see them in their full gamut of color. And this makes the retouching really easy. This also protects the painting from UV light. Now I'm going to be applying this first and then retouching atop it. And because there is so little damage on this painting, I will probably not apply a final coat of varnish, which is totally fine. The retouching paints are stabilized against UV, so they don't discolor or change over time. I would apply a final varnish if I didn't like the sheen, or there was a lot of retouching that looked different or was dried out, but I don't think that's going to be the case. This retouching should not be very complicated, and it should not require a terrible amount of time. The damage is very minimal, and that means it should be pretty quick. But just because it is pretty quick does not mean that it is going to be easy. Sometimes the retouching is very easy because the colors make sense, and sometimes you think the colors make sense, but it turns out they don't. Now, my otherwise seemingly messy palette is actually a virtue because I have most of the colors I will need already mixed, and this retouching paint can be reconstituted with a solvent, meaning that all of that mess on my palette, that's usable paint. And that means that I can kind of start on second base. I can use the paints that are already there and build from them, which makes the process much faster. Now, retouching is about making lots of colors and using them in conjunction to create a disguise, so to speak. It's almost impossible to mix perfectly the color that is on the canvas, particularly in an area like this, where multiple colors have been mixed and feathered and blended on the canvas. There are so many subtle variations that trying to mix them all perfectly is almost impossible. So what we do is mix a lot of colors that are really close, and we put them down in tiny little dots. And what we do is we give the eye enough data to send to the brain that the brain completes the image. The brain says, yep, that's what it should look like. I can't see the damage anymore. All I see is what's supposed to be there. But if we'd zoom in really, really close, we'd be able to see all of these little dots, and we'd be able to see that the colors aren't perfect. But perfect is relative, because if our eye gathers it as perfect, and our brain understands it as perfect, then maybe it actually is perfect. Now, I have probably mixed up 25 or 30 different colors and shades of brown here, and there are more to go. And this is just for this tiny little section where it looks like one color, which is what happened last time. When this damage was previously retouched, they just mixed one color and kind of painted the whole area. And that's why we could see it with the naked eye. Hopefully, by the time I'm done with this retouching, it will disappear. We won't even know that there was damage. We won't even see it. We'll just see the painting. And that is the goal of all retouching, just to make the damage disappear. Some colors are easier to mix than others, and some have a more profound impact on the painting. Obviously, adding this white here feels really, really impactful. And adding a little bit of brown to continue that little bit of color, well, it's going to make it feel complete. And our eye is going to start to understand that not as loss, but as a fluid brushstroke. Even something as little as this, right there, well, it matters. It makes it look complete. The retouching process is slow and painstaking, and I mentioned that this was supposed to be a fairly easy and straightforward process, but this one is actually surprisingly difficult. This sometimes happens when the artist mixes or blends the paint on the canvas, whereas if it's one solid color, it's much easier. When these subtle variations of brown and blue blend in together, well, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's brown or blue, which I think we can all relate to. But as I work to slowly remove all of these white spots, to fill in all of these areas and complete the image, well, the damage disappears and we can start to see the image as it's supposed to be. We can start to understand the shapes. We can start to understand this brush stroke as a highlight, not just a glob of discolored paint. And that matters because it gives us more information about the person, about the shapes, about the volume, about what we're seeing. And that completes the painting. It may be a subtle highlight, something really small. Maybe it's nuanced, but that nuance really does matter. And here is the final completed painting. A delicate image of a man lost in thought, painted with utmost respect by an incredibly talented artist who was in love with what he was painting. All of these beautiful carving brushstrokes capture the light and move us throughout the image. We can see the subtle variations in his robe as the light hits it and creates highlights and shadows. What we can't see are any vertical striations, nothing to distract us from the paint layer. We can see that the painting has been structurally stabilized. It has a new strip lining. It's mounted to a proper support, ensuring a long life ahead, and ensuring that we can start to focus on the real crux of this painting. This man, his relationship with the artist's relationship with us, and the sitter's relationship with us. And we can start to wonder, just as he is, and we too maybe can find ourselves lost in thought, just as the sitter was. Upon arrival, the painting was dark and it was yellow. There was some damage right in the center, and those vertical striations were really distracting, to say nothing of the retouching that was excessive. But after conservation, the sum of those subtle, nuanced changes, well, they add up. And maybe they're not so small after all, because the painting has undergone a radical transformation.